Captain Alex Morgan adjusted his uncomfortable diplomatic uniform and tried not to roll his eyes as General Vrax Thul of the Galactic Alliance droned on about interstellar protocols. The 7-foot-tall, blue-skinned alien had been pontificating for 23 minutes straight without taking a breath. Morgan wasn't sure if that was a biological quirk or just exceptional lung capacity fueled by self-importance. And thus, pursuant to Galactic Code 7293, subsection 42, paragraph 16. Vrax Thul continued, his voice a nasal whine that somehow managed to sound condescending in any language. The admission of a new species requires a minimum technological advancement rating of Theta 7 on the Unified Development Scale. Morgan cleared his throat. And Earth's rating is a generous Theta 2, replied Commander Peltic, the general's second in command, who resembled nothing so much as an upright praying mantis wearing military decorations. Your species only achieved faster than light travel 11 of your Earth years ago. Practically yesterday. Forgive me, Morgan said, not feeling particularly forgiving, but we did manage to reverse engineer FTL from a crashed scout ship with technology we'd never seen before. That's got to count for something. General Vrax Thul's facial tentacles rippled in what Morgan had come to recognize as the alien equivalent of a dismissive snort. Copying is not innovation, Captain. A child can trace a master's painting. It doesn't make the child an artist. And Morgan bit back a retort. He was here as Earth's representative, after all. This was humanity's first official meeting with the Galactic Alliance, and he'd been chosen partly for his diplomatic skills and partly because he had a remarkable ability to not punch condescending aliens in their facial orifices. Today was really testing that ability. The Alliance has existed for 12,000 years. Vrax Thul continued. We have perfected our systems, our protocols, our very way of life. There is a proper procedure for everything. Your species is chaotic, unpredictable. You lack the discipline required for membership. The diplomatic chamber aboard the massive Alliance station Harmonious Accord fell silent as the general's words hung in the air. The 12 members of the Alliance High Council seated around the crescent-shaped table all stared at Morgan, waiting for his response. Earth's application for membership was clearly about to be denied. Morgan leaned forward. With respect, General, maybe a fresh perspective is exactly what. A piercing alarm cut him off mid-sentence. The chamber's soft ambient lighting suddenly flashed crimson, and a calm but urgent voice echoed through the speakers. Alert. Unidentified vessels approaching. Alert. Weapons signatures detected. All personnel to defensive stations. This is not a drill. The general's facial tentacles went rigid. Impossible. No hostile force would dare attack an Alliance diplomatic hub. Commander Peltic was already consulting a holographic display that had materialized above her wrist. Sir, preliminary scans show Krell signatures and multiple vessels. Heavy armaments. Morgan raised an eyebrow. Krell, space pirates. A younger Alliance officer named Lieutenant Zen explained quickly. Unlike her superiors, she'd actually bothered to speak to Morgan like a person during his 3-day stay on the station. Violent raiders. They'd been terrorizing the outer systems for centuries. The general was already striding toward the exit. This meeting is suspended. Security protocols are now in effect. He paused at the doorway and looked back at Morgan with what might have been concern, though it was hard to tell with the facial tentacles. Captain, I suggest you return to your quarters. This is an Alliance matter. Morgan followed anyway. If this station is under attack, I think it just became everybody's matter. The Alliance Command Center was a marvel of technology and efficiency, or at least it had been 5 minutes ago. Now it more closely resembled an anthill that had been kicked over. If the ants were 7 different species of aliens all shouting at holographic displays. Status report. General Vrax Thul demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. A reptilian officer with scales that shifted from green to purple, depending on the angle of light, spoke rapidly. 3 Krell warships. Dreadnought class, 2 support vessels. Energy signatures indicate they've upgraded their weapons systems since our last encounter. Impossible, the general snapped. Our intelligence indicated they were at least 6 standard cycles away from developing those capabilities. Morgan leaned over to Lieutenant Zen. Is he always this fond of the word impossible? The general believes in order. Zen replied quietly. Deviations from expected outcomes disturb him. He must be absolutely thrilled with me. Then, Morgan muttered. A massive view screen at the front of the command center displayed the approaching Krell vessels. They were ugly, asymmetrical things that looked like someone had welded together industrial equipment without much concern for aesthetics. What they lacked in beauty, they made up for in firepower, as demonstrated when one of them fired a sickly green energy beam that crashed against the station's shields. The entire station shuddered. Status displays flickered. Shield integrity at 87%, reported Commander Peltick. That was merely a ranging shot. They're testing our defenses. General Vraxthul straightened his already impeccable uniform. They deployed defensive squadrons Alpha through Delta. Standard containment pattern 15C. Morgan watched as the Alliance fighters launched from the station's hangar bays. They moved in perfect, symmetrical formations, executing textbook maneuvers with precision. And the Krell cut through them like a hot knife through butter. Squadron Alpha is down. Someone shouted, Beta reporting heavy losses. Impossible, the general said again, though with less conviction this time. Those formations have been perfected over millennia of combat simulations. Yeah, well, Morgan said. I'm guessing the Krell didn't participate in those simulations. The general shot him a withering look, but before he could respond, the station rocked again, much harder this time. Warning lights flashed across every console. A direct hit on sections 12 through 14, Peltick reported. Shield integrity at 63% and falling. They're not following standard attack patterns, the reptilian officer said, his scales now a stressed bright orange. Their approach vectors are completely random. The general's facial tentacles were practically tied in knots. Deploy the reserve squadrons. Pattern 22B, and activate the automated defense systems. Deploy. Morgan stepped closer to the tactical display. Your fighters are too predictable. The Krell are anticipating your moves because you're following preset patterns. These are battle-tested formations, Captain, the general said stiffly. The product of thousands of years of military science. And they're failing spectacularly, Morgan pointed out as another squadron of Alliance fighters disappeared from the tactical display. Your pilots need to improvise. Improvise? The general practically spat the word. Chaos is not a strategy, Captain. The station shook again, harder this time. Several officers were thrown from their seats. Shield integrity at 41%. Peltick announced, her mantis-like features rigid with concern. Sections 20 through 25 reporting hull breaches. Emergency containment active. Sir. Lieutenant Zen interjected. The Krell are deploying boarding craft. They've breached the outer defense perimeter. The general's facial tentacles went completely still, which Morgan had learned was a sign of deep distress among his species. They'd deploy all remaining security forces to repel boarders. Execute Defensive Protocol Omega. What's Defensive Protocol Omega? Morgan asked. It means we're in serious trouble, Zen replied quietly. Morgan watched as the situation deteriorated rapidly. The Krell ships continued their seemingly random attack patterns, rendering the Alliance's carefully choreographed defenses useless. The station's shields were failing, and the reports of boarding parties grew more numerous by the minute. And through it all, General Vraxthul continued to issue orders straight from the tactical manual, even as those tactics proved ineffective one after another. Your rigid protocols are getting your people killed, Morgan finally said, unable to stay silent any longer. The general turned to him, facial tentacles quivering with barely contained emotion. And what would you suggest, Captain? The Alliance has faced and defeated threats for millennia before your species even left your planet's surface. Maybe, Morgan said. But right now, you're losing to space pirates. Sir, Commander Peltick interrupted. Security teams report Krell boarding parties have reached level 8. They're advancing toward the command center. The general's facial tentacles drooped slightly. How many Alliance vessels are responding to our distress call? The nearest battle group is 3 hours away at maximum speed, Peltick replied. And how long until our shields fail completely? At current rate of depletion, approximately 18 minutes. The command center went silent as the implications sank in. The station would be completely vulnerable long before help could arrive. General Vraxthul turned to Morgan. Captain, I assume Earth has dispatched vessels to protect its representative. No, Morgan said simply. No? The general's facial tentacles twitched in confusion. But surely your government would not send its diplomat without protection. Where is your backup? Beg. Morgan spread his hands and gave the general a lopsided grin. You're looking at it. The silence that followed was profound. You came alone? The general's voice was incredulous. One human against the possibility of conflict with an entire galactic community. Well, when you put it that way, it does sound a bit reckless, Morgan admitted. But Earth figured if things went south, one ship wouldn't make much difference anyway. And if things went well, we wouldn't need it. And what about now? Lieutenant Zen asked. When things have definitely gone south, but not in the way anyone expected. Morgan stepped closer to the main tactical display. Now, I suggest we stop trying to fight the Krell according to some millennia-old playbook and start getting creative. He pointed to the display. May I? After a moment's hesitation, the general nodded, and Morgan enlarged the station schematics. The Krell are attacking in unpredictable patterns, right? So let's be unpredictable too. What if we deliberately overload the power couplings in sections 30 through 34? It would look like a catastrophic system failure that would shut down a quarter of our defensive systems. Peltic protested. Exactly, Morgan said. The Krell would think they've scored a critical hit. They'd concentrate their forces there, trying to exploit the weakness. And then? The general asked, his tone skeptical but no longer dismissive. And then we spring the trap. Reroute emergency power to those sections and hit them with everything we've got when they're clustered together. The general's facial tentacles wavered uncertainly. That would require taking defensive systems offline during an attack. It violates at least 17 safety protocols. Those protocols aren't saving you right now, Morgan pointed out. Sometimes you have to risk something to gain something. It's a principle that served humanity well. Risk is not the Alliance way, the general said. But his resolve seemed to be weakening. Maybe it should be, Lieutenant Zen suggested. Just this once. This once. The station shook again as another Krell weapon found its mark. Shield integrity at 32%. Peltic reported grimly. The general looked at the tactical display, at his failing defenses, and then at Morgan. Very well, Captain. We will try your improvisation. But if this fails, we're no worse off than we are now. Morgan finished for him. But it won't fail. As the general reluctantly gave the orders to implement Morgan's plan, the human moved to another console. And there's something else we can do. Your communication systems, can they be modified to broadcast on Krell frequencies? The reptilian officer looked up in surprise. Technically, yes, but... Good. Because I've got an idea that will really mess with their heads. This is absolute madness, Commander Peltic declared as Morgan finished outlining his plan. You want us to broadcast fake orders to the Krell fleet? That violates every communication protocol in the Alliance handbook. Not to mention 17 different regulations about electronic warfare, added the reptilian officer, whose name Morgan had finally learned was Security Chief Draz. Exactly, Morgan said with a grin. And that's precisely why the Krell won't expect it. Lieutenant Zen was already working at her console. I can modify our transmitters to mimic Krell command signatures, but we'll need to know their language, their codes. We have intercepts, Draz admitted reluctantly. Captured communications we've been studying for years. Perfect, Morgan said. Meanwhile, I need control of the station's maintenance drones. The general, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. The maintenance drones are not combat units, Captain. No, but there are hundreds of them. They can move in 0G, and they carry welding equipment, right? That's good enough for what I have in mind. As the Alliance officers reluctantly began implementing Morgan's increasingly unorthodox plans, the human moved from console to console, suggesting modifications and adjustments that frequently caused the operators to look at him, as if he'd suggested using their own limbs as bait. You can't reroute coolant systems to function as emergency propulsion, one engineer protested. Sure you can, Morgan replied cheerfully. It's just high-pressure fluid. Physics doesn't care what you call it. The station rocked again as another Krell blast struck home. Shields at 25%, Peltic announced. And we now have confirmed boarding parties on levels 5 through 9. Perfect timing, Morgan said, earning him several incredulous looks. Start the power shutdown in sections 30 through 34. Make it look convincing. The lights flickered as power was diverted. On the tactical display, a large section of the station went dark. Now broadcast the fake orders to the Krell fleet, Morgan instructed. Tell their boarding parties to concentrate on the damaged sections. Lieutenant Zen's fingers flew over her console. Transmitting now. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the tactical display showed the Krell ships adjusting their attack patterns. It's working, Draz said, a note of surprise in his voice. They're redirecting their boarding craft to the depowered sections. Of course it's working, Morgan said. Pirates aren't big on questioning orders, especially when those orders seem to be offering them an easy target. General Vraxthul's facial tentacles twisted in what might have been the alien equivalent of a reluctant smile. I must admit, Captain, your tactics are unorthodox. That's a diplomatic way of saying completely insane, Morgan replied with a grin. But insanity is humanity's specialty. The next phase of Morgan's plan unfolded as the maintenance drones, now reprogrammed for combat, emerged from their storage bays. Hundreds of the small, spider-like robots swarmed out of the station's maintenance tubes and began moving toward the sections where the Krell boarding parties were concentrating. The drones are in position, Zen reported. But sir, their welding tools won't be very effective against Krell armor. They don't need to be, Morgan explained. They just need to be annoying. On the security feeds, they watched as the drones descended upon the surprised Krell boarders. The pirates, expecting minimal resistance in the damaged sections, instead found themselves under attack by swarms of small robots. The drones weren't causing much damage, but they were creating confusion and slowing the Krell advance. Now for the next part, Morgan said. The coolant propulsion system? Ready, replied the engineer who had protested earlier, now looking far less skeptical. Fire it up. Fire it up. The station gave a sudden lurch as emergency coolant was vented through makeshift thrusters, causing the entire station to rotate in space. The maneuver was ungraceful and would have horrified any pilot, but it had the desired effect. The Krell ships, which had been positioning themselves to target specific sections of the station, suddenly found their targeting solutions useless. They're recalculating, Draz reported, his scales now a surprised blue. Their fire rate has dropped by 60%. That's our window, Morgan said. Reroute power back to the damaged sections and hit the Krell boarding parties with everything we've got. The lights in the command center dimmed as power surged to the defensive systems in the sections where the Krell had concentrated their forces. Security feeds showed the pirates suddenly caught in crossfire from defense turrets they thought were disabled. At the same time, the Alliance fighters that had been held in reserve executed a completely unplanned, asymmetrical attack pattern against the confused Krell ships, thus scoring several direct hits. General Vraxthul seemed at a loss for words. Chaotic? Morgan suggested. Unpredictable? Effective? All of the above, the general admitted, watching as the tide of battle began to shift. But the Krell were not defeated yet. Their commander, apparently realizing they'd been tricked, ordered a new attack pattern. The largest of the Krell ships began a direct approach toward the station's main reactor section. They're going to try to take out our power core, Peltic warned. If they succeed, the entire station will be destroyed. Morgan studied the tactical display. They're committing all their resources to a single attack vector. That's actually good news. How is that possibly good news? The general demanded. Morgan smiled. Because now they're the predictable ones. All right, time for Phase 3, Morgan announced, rubbing his hands together with an enthusiasm that made several Alliance officers exchange nervous glances. There's a Phase 3? General Vraxthul asked, his facial tentacles twitching in what Morgan had come to recognize as the alien equivalent of raised eyebrows. Of course there's a Phase 3, Morgan replied. You can't have a proper plan without at least 3 phases. It's practically a human requirement. Lieutenant Zen looked up from her console. The Krell flagship is powering up what appears to be their main weapon. Energy readings are off the scale. They're going for a killing blow, Draz said, his scales shifting to a worried purple. directly targeting our reactor core. Perfect, Morgan said, earning him several incredulous stares. That's exactly what we want them to do. The general's facial tentacles twisted in confusion. You want them to destroy the station? No, I want them to try to destroy the station, Morgan corrected. There's a crucial difference. Lieutenant Zen, are those magnetic containment adjustments I asked for ready? Zen nodded. Yes, but I still don't understand how this is supposed to work. You will. Now, on my mark, I want you to reverse the polarity of the magnetic containment field around the reactor core. Peltic's mantis-like head jerked up. That would expose the core to a very specific type of radiation. Yes, Morgan finished for her. The same type of radiation that the Krell's main weapon produces, only instead of damaging our core, it's going to supercharge it. The general stared at him. You're going to use their weapon to power our station. For about 30 seconds, yes, Morgan confirmed. Just long enough to give us the energy boost we need for what comes next. The tactical display showed the Krell flagship moving into position, its massive forward cannon glowing with ominous green energy. They're preparing to fire, Draz reported, impact in 15 seconds. Morgan looked at Lieutenant Zen. Ready? She nodded. Her fingers poised over the controls. 10 seconds. Draz counted down. 9, 8. Everything we've done so far has been leading to this moment, Morgan said quietly. We've forced them to commit to a single, predictable attack vector, 5-4. And now we're going to use their own strength against them. 3-2. Now, Lieutenant. Morgan ordered. Zen's fingers flew across her console, reversing containment field polarity. The lights in the command center flickered and died as power was diverted to the reactor core. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in a dim red glow. 1. Draz whispered. The Krell flagship fired. A massive beam of sickly green energy lanced out, striking the station precisely where the reactor core was located. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in suspended animation. Then the station's power grid surged back to life. The consoles lit up with readings that were literally off the charts. Energy levels at 300% of normal capacity, Peltic reported, her voice filled with disbelief. The core is stable. But we can't maintain this state for long. We don't need long, Morgan said. Just long enough to reroute all that excess power to the station's tractor beams. The tractor beams? The general repeated. Those are for guiding damaged ships to dock, not for combat. Today they're for combat, Morgan said firmly. Target the Krell flagship and hit it with everything we've got. The station hummed with power as the tractor beam emitters, never designed to handle such energy levels, fired concentrated beams at the Krell flagship. The pirate vessel, caught in the act of firing its main weapon, couldn't maneuver out of the way. The tractor beams seized the Krell ship, holding it in place. But instead of simply immobilizing it, the overcharged beams began to crush the vessel like a giant fist. The structural integrity of their ship is failing, Draz reported, his scales now a surprised bright yellow. Their weapon systems are going offline. On the view screen, they could see the Krell flagship being literally squeezed by the invisible force of the tractor beams. Metal groaned and buckled as the ship's hull compressed under the impossible pressure. Core energy levels dropping, Peltic warned. We can maintain this output for another 20 seconds at most. That's all we need, Morgan assured her. General, I suggest you contact the remaining Krell vessels and offer them a choice, retreat or join their flagship. The general's facial tentacles waved in what might have been admiration, or possibly just shock. Lieutenant Zen, open a channel to the Krell fleet. As the general delivered his ultimatum, Morgan watched the tactical display. The remaining Krell vessels, seeing their flagship being crushed before their eyes, began to power up their engines. They're retreating, Draz announced, his scales shifting to a victorious gold color. All Krell vessels are breaking off their attack. A cheer went up from the command center staff, quickly silenced by a sharp gesture from the general. Power levels returning to normal, Peltic reported. Your stability resuming standard parameters. Morgan watched as the tractor beams released their grip on the Krell flagship, now a twisted wreck of metal floating harmlessly in space. Well, he said, turning to the general with a grin, I'd say that went pretty well for an improvised defense, wouldn't you? General Vraxthul's facial tentacles were completely still. A sign Morgan had learned indicated deep thought. "Captain Morgan," he said finally, "I believe I owe you an apology." The aftermath of the battle left the Harmonious Accord station looking decidedly less harmonious. Repair crews worked frantically to patch hull breaches, while medical teams treated the injured. The command center, however, had returned to its normal efficient operation, albeit with a new undercurrent of excitement. Damage reports indicate 37% of station systems require repairs, Commander Peltick announced, consulting her holographic display. However, there were minimal casualties, and no critical systems were permanently disabled. A remarkable outcome, General Vraxthul acknowledged, considering the overwhelming force we faced. He turned to Morgan, who was nursing a cup of what the station's food synthesizers claimed was coffee. "Captain, the Alliance owes you a debt of gratitude." Morgan took a sip of the coffee and tried not to grimace. "Just doing my job, General. Though I'm pretty sure battling space pirates wasn't in my diplomatic briefing. That's what I find most remarkable," the General said, his facial tentacles moving in a pattern that Morgan now recognized as indicating curiosity. "You had no training for this scenario, no established protocols to follow, and yet you devised an effective counter-strategy in minutes." "Well, humans are pretty good at making things up as we go along," Morgan replied with a shrug. "It's kind of our specialty." Lieutenant Zen approached, carrying a datapad. "Sir, the engineering team would like to document Captain Morgan's modifications to the station's systems. They're particularly interested in the coolant propulsion concept." The General nodded. "Yes, a full documentation of these improvisations would be valuable for our tactical database." Morgan couldn't help but laugh. "So you're going to turn my seat of the pants improvisation into another set of rigid protocols?" "Protocol ensures consistency, Captain," the General replied, though his tone was less dogmatic than before. "But perhaps there is room for flexibility in their application." Security Chief Draz joined them, his scales now a calm blue. "The last of the Krell boarding parties has been neutralized. We've taken 17 prisoners." 17? Morgan raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot of mouths to feed." "Indeed," the General agreed. "Our standard procedure would be to hold them for transfer to an Alliance detention facility." "You know," Morgan said thoughtfully, "there might be a better use for them. The Krell obviously have information about this sector that your intelligence lacks. Maybe instead of just locking them up, you could offer them reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation." The General's facial tentacles twisted in what might have been surprise. "You suggest we negotiate with pirates?" "I suggest you be pragmatic," Morgan corrected. "You were caught off guard today because your information was outdated. These prisoners could help prevent that from happening again." The General considered this for a long moment, an unorthodox approach, but perhaps a valid one. Commander Peltick approached with another report. "Sir, the Alliance Council is requesting your presence. They wish to resume the diplomatic session with Earth's representative." The General's facial tentacles rippled in what Morgan had come to recognize as amusement. "I suspect their assessment of Earth's application may have changed somewhat." Morgan grinned. "Nothing like saving everyone's lives to make a good first impression." As they made their way back to the diplomatic chamber, Morgan noticed the way the station's crew looked at him now with respect, and even a touch of awe. Several nodded to him as he passed, and one young engineer actually asked to shake his hand. "You've made quite an impression," Lieutenant Zen observed as they walked. "Aid. The Alliance doesn't adapt to new ideas easily. That's the funny thing about crisis situations," Morgan replied. "They have a way of making you reconsider what's possible." The diplomatic chamber had been hastily restored after the battle. The Alliance Council members were already seated, looking somewhat less formal than before. Several had torn uniforms or minor injuries bandaged. "Captain Morgan," the Council chairperson began as he entered, "the Alliance owes you a great debt. Your unconventional tactics saved this station and everyone aboard it." Morgan inclined his head. "Just glad I could help." Before the interruption, the chairperson continued, "We were discussing Earth's application for Alliance membership. At that time, concerns were raised about humanity's suitability." General Vraxthul stepped forward. "If I may, Chairperson, I believe those concerns were misplaced, or rather, what we perceived as weaknesses may in fact be strengths. A murmur ran through the council. Captain Morgan demonstrated today that adaptability, even chaos, can be a powerful asset, the general continued. While the Alliance has perfected order, we have perhaps sacrificed something valuable in the process, the ability to think beyond our established parameters. Are you suggesting, one council member asked incredulously, that we should abandon our protocols? Not at all, the general replied. I am suggesting that we supplement them, that we recognize different approaches have different merits. Morgan watched in amazement as the general who had so recently dismissed humans as primitive now advocated for Earth's inclusion. The universe is not static, Vraxthul concluded. If the Alliance wishes to endure for another 12,000 years, perhaps we need what humans call fresh perspectives. The council chairperson looked thoughtful. Captain Morgan, do all humans share your improvisational abilities? Morgan laughed. Oh, I'm actually one of the more restrained examples of my species. You should meet our engineers. They once fixed a malfunctioning spacecraft with duct tape and a paperclip. The council members exchanged glances that suggested they weren't sure if he was joking. I believe the chairperson said finally that the council should reconsider Earth's application. Recent events have demonstrated that technological advancement is not the only measure of a species' potential contribution to the Alliance. As the meeting concluded with an agreement to establish formal diplomatic relations with Earth, Morgan found himself surrounded by curious Alliance officials eager to learn more about human improvisation techniques. I'm not sure this is something you can teach in a seminar, he told them, amused by their sudden interest. Perhaps not, General Vraxthul said, joining the group, but it is something we can learn to appreciate. Captain, I've been authorized to extend an invitation for Earth to send additional representatives to the Alliance, perhaps even a cultural exchange program. Morgan grinned. I think that can be arranged, though you might want to pirate-proof the station first. Actually, the general replied, his facial tentacles forming what Morgan now recognized as the alien's version of a smile. I was hoping you might share some more of your backup plans. 3 months later, the first official Earth Alliance cultural exchange program was well underway. Lieutenant Zen had volunteered to serve as Earth's liaison and was currently trying to explain the concept of jazz music to a group of bewildered Alliance cultural officers. But how can they all play different notes and still create harmony? One officer asked, clearly struggling with the concept. That's the beauty of it, Zen replied, having become something of a human culture enthusiast. Structure and improvisation working together. In another section of the station, Security Chief Draz was demonstrating new tactical simulations that incorporated what was now officially called Morgan protocols, essentially a controlled chaos, as a combat strategy. And in the main observation lounge, General Vraxthul stood beside Captain Morgan, watching as an Earth vessel docked with the station, bringing the next group of human representatives. Your people continue to surprise us, the general admitted. Just yesterday, one of your engineers suggested using dessert sprinkles to detect microscopic hull breaches. Did it work? Morgan asked. Remarkably well, the general replied, his facial tentacles twitching in amusement. The Alliance Engineering Corps is still trying to understand why. Morgan laughed. That's humanity for you. We're the species that looked at a problem and said, what if we try cake decorations? The general was silent for a moment, then said, the Council has been discussing the Unified Development Scale. There is talk of adding new categories, ones that measure adaptability and creative problem solving. Moving up in the world, are we? Morgan grinned. Indeed, the general replied. Though I suspect humanity will still find ways to confound our metrics. As they watched the new arrivals disembark, Morgan spotted a human woman enthusiastically explaining something to her Alliance escort, complete with expansive hand gestures. What is she describing? The general asked, fascinated. Morgan squinted. If I had to guess, I'd say she's explaining the plot of a reality TV show. And this is significant human culture? Oh, absolutely not. Morgan laughed. But it's definitely human. The general's facial tentacles waved in what Morgan had come to recognize as genuine amusement. I begin to understand why your species sent just one representative for first contact. Oh, And why's that? Because, the general said with newfound respect, sometimes one human is backup enough.